In the opening moments, we're shown a high-angle sweeping shot of Onett, letting the player get to somewhat know the game world before they're given control. The scene has intertitles spliced in, delivering the information that the year is 1990X and this country is called Eagleland, ostensibly a parody of the United States. Straight up exposition? Yes, but it's kept short and sweet, explaining these things in as few words as possible. So you know what? I'm actually okay with this. There's really no other way to convey this information that wouldn't just be text otherwise. This opening cutscene actually is structured like an essay itself, starting broad with the whole town of Onett and the general information, and eventually making it more and more specific, getting to the protagonist's house. The music throughout is also great at setting up the atmosphere, mimicking the sounds the player already has been taught to affiliate with aliens from the title screen, and the beat of the protagonist hearing a loud noise then getting out of bed to investigate is really easy to understand and immediately sets up the protagonist as a curious and courageous boy. And the whole scene invokes the settings and atmospheres of E.T. the Extraterrestrial and Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and anyone familiar with these properties will immediately understand the idea of the scene. The ambience also helps set the mood, very foreboding. And with that, the player finally gets control of the main character. The door is white, which makes it even with the blue filter on the room pop out, and as this takes place in a modern setting, it's immediately clear to the player that they can exit through it. This room also is conducive to the player experimenting with the controls, as there's no music to push them forward, allowing for them to get acquainted with the menus. The off-balancedness of it due to the player not learning PSI yet leaves room for some mystery, enticing the player to figure out what important mechanic they're lacking. This is also an opportunity for the player to get acquainted with the inventory system and learn that they can get an explanation of items at any time, as well as with their stats. The status screen again invokes the alluring mystery of PSI, referred to as psychic points in the other menu, informing the player that the game does have some sort of magic mechanic. By exiting the room, the player is met with a door at the upper part of the screen as well as the room continuing to the left, and no matter which way the player goes first, this teaches them that branching paths will be a regular occurrence. By entering Tracy's room, the player is both taught how to talk to NPCs and check for items. The use of the present as a substitute for the common treasure chest found in other games is lovely, and the game makes it very clear to players that these are rewards, goodies for you to enjoy, and the red bow sticks out in contrast to the room's abundance of pink. When the player takes the cracked bat, the previous menu is still visible, allowing the player to make the connection that they should equip it, and if a player is inclined to use the help feature to learn about this weapon, it explicitly makes it clear that the player should equip it. By attempting to equip it, the player is informed of other types of armor, and that equipment can affect a character's offense and defense. In doing these things, it's likely the player will also notice that when using the menus, it pauses the game in an informal way, being demonstrated by it freezing Tracy as she walks around the room. By leaving the room, the player now knows that optional paths will be present and that they might be rewarded for exploring them. With the stairs being the only other path, the player is led to the main floor of the protagonist's house. The contrasting layout informs the player that the game is not laid out in a straight path. By talking to the mother, the protagonist is changed into his iconic outfit, teaching the player that by talking to NPCs, major changes can happen. But the game also doesn't force players into this, allowing for more experienced players to immediately head out, making it both more friendly to the experienced as well as trimming the fat for those repeat playthroughs. If the player revisits Tracy, she'll have new dialogue, indicating that certain events will cause some characters to have different dialogue, though this is also demonstrated the player talks to the mother again. By seeing the dog they named, the player will be drawn to interact with it, and this dialogue introduces to the player that they can interact with animals as well. By finally exiting the house, the player is brought to the overworld, where by heading south we'll see NPCs to their right. Heading towards them, the player is informed of the meteoroid, and by checking the sign now knows that Onett is to the south, but they can't go there yet. By heading back to the branching path, the player may feel inclined to head left now, seeing another NPC. With the reiterance of the information about the meteor, it's made crystal clear that that's the current objective. This leads the player near Pokey's house, which introduces Picky and clarifies Pokey as a character of interest. The house also features the same track as the protagonist, introducing a parallel between the protagonist and Pokey, the layouts of the houses even being very similar, but contrasting in color, as the protagonist's house has warmer colors suggesting a more loving home than Pokey's much emptier, colder house, which is suggested by the lack of people in colder blues. Picky's text also indicates a disjointedness about their family, letting the player know that Pokey and Picky's parents are willing to enjoy themselves without them, and there being some tension between the brothers. With no other option, the player heads south. On the path, police officer NPCs introduce the Sharks gang and makes note of wandering kids, which even though is likely interpreted as being about the protagonist, also again suggests Pokey as a figure to be noteworthy. Heading along the path, it eventually comes to an end, but clarifying to the player to keep going in this direction by cueing them with another NPC. This is a visual indication that there will be points where the path forward is not spelled out for you, and there will be times when the player has to make their own decisions about where to go. This way also shows a house obscured by the woods below, probing the player to want to explore it, as the visual of it being hidden in the trees indicates it to be some sort of secret, which in games often directly correlates to a reward, which the player will receive later if they pay attention. More on that later though. Continuing on the path, a present can be seen on the cliff, and it contrasts so much with the surrounding colors and is itself so out of place, the player will be drawn to it. This is important because if the player didn't grasp presents back at the house, the repetition of them here indicates that they'll be an important part of the game, and will encourage players to return the house when possible to check what's in that one as well. The player then passes the traveling entertainer shack and entrance to Giant Step, again stirring the player's curiosity. The player then loops back to the east to the present, teaching them that sometimes items seen at an earlier point will become more attainable at a later point, then receiving a bread roll, which introduces them to recovery items, the item description notably explaining in terms of HP, which we'll come back to later. Heading north, the player will encounter Liar Exaggerate, who contrasts so much with the police officer sprites the player will be inclined to talk to him. His text introduces his eccentric personality and grossness, and introduces the player to reading signs if they haven't figured them out already. While not subtle, this cop reiterates the importance of the meteorite, but does so in a funny way, which in my opinion makes more obvious instructions like this much more digestible and fun, and lets the player feel less talked down to and more like they're being joked around with. The player then arrives at a roadblock, and is drawn to Pokey due to his visual contrast with the police officers, and if the player doesn't get this, the NPCs clarify it, this one even making it clear they're neighbors regardless of the dialogue option chosen, which will either introduce this information to the player, which they'll need to know later when taking Pokey and Picky home, or creates the connection for the player already aware from exploring Pokey's house that this character is the one Picky was referring to. By talking to Pokey, the player is introduced to a lot of important information about him as a character. It suggests many things about him, that he's about putting on appearances, especially in relation to people in more powerful positions, that he's pompous, obsessed with being important, and that he's not very good at reading social situations, all core elements that play a major part in his story. Additionally, he makes it clear to the player to return to the protagonist's house, and does so in a way that accentuates these traits. Him being the one to deliver this information in this way also introduces a distaste for Pokey in the player, being the character who's portrayed as being in the way of the player's current goal, get to the meteor, which visually contrasts so heavily to draw the player towards it. Other than its importance, its contrast also helps emphasize its otherworldliness, its warm colors being on the polar opposite side of the color wheel from the cooler blue-green tones of the rest of the environment, marking a distinct separation between the worlds of the aliens and nature. Upon returning home, the player meets with the mother outside the house. Her dialogue clearly indicates the end of this segment, but also allows for the player to continue exploring if they'd like, encouraging exploration. Later that night, the protagonist is awoken again, this time by an unrelenting knock on the door, even being pointed out as being annoying by Tracy. The person knocking being Pokey, this again reiterates his personality, and will grow the player's distaste for him once it's revealed to be him. The knock aurally conveys to the player to go to the door, letting the story continue in a natural way. The music also creates some tension, with mysterious and ominous sounds, and is furthered by the mother's text, though I find this moment to be a bit odd, as she clearly puts her son in danger, though this disregard for him doesn't seem to be a recurring element of her character, so I'm a bit mixed on this line. The sound continues to tell the story, as when Pokey enters, the short musical motif plays, suggesting ruination, another important element to Pokey's story. Then quickly transitioning into a fast-paced piece, suggesting panic, urging the player to continue. Here, Pokey's character through text is furthered, his comment about the protagonist's mother showing his personality and primal urges could distract him from his objective, regardless of its importance. It also shows that, not revealed until later, that Pokey is completely willing to lie to protect himself, as well as being quick to shift blame. He is also willing to both suck up to and berate those he views as necessary, but also confessing that he lacks the willpower to follow through with the latter. His comments about the mother again suggest an aura of immaturity in the sort of way perverted young boys are. The protagonist's mother then ignores him, reaffirming that he's not taken seriously, then reminds the player about the cracked bat if they've forgotten. I find it weird and preemptive, though, that the mother and Tracy both treat the protagonist leaving now as if it's the start of his big adventure that doesn't really begin for another little while. I like the text here quite a bit and find it well written, it just seems way too early and feels over the top for the current situation. By talking to Tracy, the player will receive a cookie, showing that by talking to NPCs, they can receive rewards beyond just information, and also introduces Tracy's storage system. I also love the mom's line here. The dog then joins the party, demonstrating that the party members physically follow you on the field, as opposed to other RPGs of the time, where they'd essentially go into a person inventory until battle started. Pokey then joins, his text showing he's willing to let others do his dirty work for him. Then we're off. The phone's over-the-top animation leads the player to it, along with its tone, and introduces the protagonist's father. This moment introduces the father as a mysterious figure, calling his son in the middle of the night to encourage him and deposit money into his bank account for seemingly no reason at all, and working on a nondescript job. This moment also introduces a quiet sadness present throughout the game, the protagonist having an absent father, who calls primarily regarding monetary concerns and always being the one to hang up first. He also teaches the player to save their progress with phones, which I believe is symbolic of absent parents becoming more so symbols in their children's perceptions of them, in this case that symbol being a rotary phone, an impersonal, cold mode of communication. This is furthered by the father literally being portrayed as a phone during the ending credits of the game, but I'm getting way ahead of myself at that point. Exiting the house, the player enters the hostility the world of EarthBound holds. Right away, the player will likely be encountered by either a spiteful crow or runaway dog, which demonstrate different things. A runaway dog directly contrasts the player's pet dog, showing the evil influence over the world is even corrupting things held dear to us, and in visually contrasting the pet dog also lets the player know evil versions of things they know will also look different, sort of foreshadowing how people under Gygas's influence later are shown to have discolored skin. A spiteful crow, on the other hand, demonstrates item stealing mechanics in battle, as they'll often attempt to steal items, as well as enemies dropping items. The runaway dog can also drop items, but the spiteful crow offers a 100% chance of dropping a cookie, so I assume this enemy is intended to act as the surrogate for this teaching moment. Additionally, the player can encounter a coil snake, which will teach them simple battle mechanics and simple status ailments, but not posing much of a threat to the player, and also parallel the Garden of Eden in the Bible, in which the world's first enemy is described as a serpent, which may seem reaching, but plenty of other references to the Garden of Eden are made later in the game, so I stand by this as possibly being intentional. In these early battles, players are also shown the lava lamp-inspired backgrounds of battle screens, and subconsciously learn that these backgrounds somewhat give off the vibe of the enemies themselves, giving each battle a distinct atmosphere. Regardless of which is seen first, however, the player will most likely run into at least one of each enemy on their way up the mountain. EarthBound also made strides by having overworld sprites for enemies, which was pretty uncommon at the time, and makes the game feel that much more real. Now the player is introduced to the battle system. The system is very intuitive and keeps things pretty straightforward, and the enemies in this area are weak enough that players are allowed to experiment with the different battle commands, and stakes are low, as if they die they'll just go back to the protagonist's house. The player will also learn quickly that both enemies and allies won't always be the most effective during battles. However, the pet dog often proves useful, and reiterates the central idea of being stronger as a team. The pet dog will also likely be the one to introduce smash attacks to the player, and the visual and audio cues for this makes the effect of them very clear, as most people already have an archetype in their heads that green equals good. The flashing of green affirms this, as well as the crushing and satisfying sound of landing one. And inevitably, the player will also learn that they can achieve these for themselves. The player will also quickly learn to maintain their HP, as the connection is clear that it drops as enemies attack, and it reaching 0 is probably a bad thing, and will learn how to use their items accordingly, as they will make their HP go back up. And again, the environment is safe enough where the penalties for dying are pretty minimal, even in the capacity for losing half of their money, as battles up the mountain are mostly unavoidable, they'll easily earn it back. Before long, the player will achieve a level up and learn Life Up Alpha. The celebratory jingle and visuals and text of their stats increasing shows fighting battles increases your strength. Some players might go ahead and immediately test Life Up for themselves in the new PSI menu when they find it. Some even going as far as to read its exact function in the status screen, and others will find its use in battle, as the PSI menu in the overworld easily conveys Life Up as a PSI ability, seeing as it appears after learning it, and will look for it in the menu. Here the player will also see that various uses for PSI exist for different situations, and the name Life Up pretty clearly conveys its use. Whichever way it's done, the player is shown that by using the ability their PP level drops, indicating that more useful techniques will come at a more significant cost, PP's importance being shown by the lack of any ability to restore it, sans visiting mom. In making their way up the mountain, the player is shown the different meanings of the battle swirls, as players rushing past enemies will see the red swirl due to the game giving the player their dog and Pokey to lag behind them and get caught, and weaker enemies will run away, players attacking anyway seeing the green swirl, again using colors to easily show when these things are good and bad. High up on the mountain, the player will again run into Liar Exaggerate, and is drawn to talk to him as he's the only NPC still outside. He delivers some direction about Picky's whereabouts, and the player makes their way to him as he comes into view almost immediately after. Upon reaching the top of the mountain, our dog is frightened and rushes back home. By checking the meteor, the text says that the meteor is still dangerous, reiterating the dangers of the extraterrestrial world. And by talking to Picky, more is revealed of Pokey's character, that he's a liar and a coward. On their way back, the player is interrupted by Pokey, asking if they hear a buzzing sound, and is given an opportunity to shut him down if they want to vent some frustration towards him. A beam then releases from the meteor, and Buzz emerges from it. This visual conveys Buzz's role in the greater story, with the meteor symbolizing the future's destruction, with Buzz being a beam of hope in repairing it, also being accompanied by a relieving theme as he's introduced. All of this before the player knows a single thing about him. Buzz then explains his mission to prevent Gygus from ever plunging the world into darkness, the player already understanding Gygus as the antagonist, as indicated by the title screen. What I love about this block of dialogue is how easily understandable it is, in a genre of storytelling known for being extremely convoluted when time travel is involved. Pokey, right after having Buzz joining you, complains that he hopes he isn't one of these 3 chosen boys Buzz mentioned. Now there's a few things to unpack here. First, an almost nervous feeling implanted into the player of, oh no, what if he is one of them and I have to deal with him the entire game? And second, Buzz is buzzing non-stop playing. It's immediately annoying, something the game definitely does not shy away from doing to the player at other points, and the player's led to believe at this point that Buzz and Pokey will permanently be party members, and I love that this is essentially a big joke being played on the player, implanting a subtle fear that they will be annoyed for the entire game. It's hilarious and very a toy, if not a bit risky. On their way back down, the player will likely talk to Liar Exaggerate again, as now that Picky has joined the party, the player would have been led to believe that his text from before would have changed. His text asking the protagonist to meet alone plays an ominous musical phrase, indicating that what is being said is significant and furthering Liar as a mysterious character. Enemy spawns have been turned off for this section, allowing for the player to easily make their way down the mountain, which I'll explain the intention of in a moment, and is then stopped again. Here they'll be stopped by Starman Jr, whose design is another reference to The War of the Worlds, reiterating his sci-fi aesthetic, and informs that he is a bounty hunter from the future after Buzz, his emergence from a white beam contrasting with Buzz's yellow one to mark the robotic and unfeeling nature of the latter. The battle then engages, the player being introduced to the theme to more significant story battles musically, as well as visually, with the swirl's sharp edges. The music's robotic aesthetic and jittery background almost glitching reiterates the Starman Jr.'s cold presence, and the use of darker warm colors make him pop out from the background. Here, the player is shown several of the PSI abilities to come and their applications, and also is shown just how strong they can become through Buzz's raw strength. With the Starman Jr. defeated, the player hears the triumphant arrangement of the winning theme, and is most likely to get a level up immediately following this, enhancing the victorious feeling. This moment is exciting and gives the player motivation to grow stronger by giving them the desire to become as strong as Buzz, and this moment is preserved for this battle by removing enemy spawns on the way down, so the player can experience Buzz's abilities in a battle against a strong opponent, and the reveal isn't squandered on a coil snake. This opening segment has problems with repetitiveness and is a bit of a chore on repeat playthroughs, but this moment does at least some of it right. On arriving at Pokey's house, the player will encounter the boy's parents, giving the feeling of being caught, which actually goes right along with their father being named Aloysius Minch, a clear parody of Atticus Finch from To Kill a Mockingbird, in which a similar moment occurs of children being caught by adults. This character's connection to Atticus Finch also being a clear juxtaposition of the loving but fair father with Aloysius's cruelty and unfairness. These connections are even furthered by their mother's dialogue, saying, "What in Sam Hill?" a phrase commonly used in the southern United States, where To Kill a Mockingbird takes place. The father's display of abuse introduces Pokey's clearly troubled home life, along with the verbal abuse and almost sadism shown by the parents, as well as their materialistic patterns of thinking. Aloysius also adds to the protagonist's mysterious father's aura, indicating they've lent a substantial amount of money to their family, regardless if exaggerated or not. The mother then furthers their sadism and then murders Buzz Buzz. The music stops, and the player is left shocked into laughter, as it's made perfectly clear that all of Buzz Buzz's buildup as a powerful figure was the setup of a joke, just for him to be killed by an ugly lady. The humor subsides, but the moment is still kept somewhat lighter, as Buzz Buzz's dying words are clearly an allusion to the drawn-out deaths in some Shakespearean characters, even following up with his initial dialogue with, "Oh, I just remembered," before going on a long tangent. Buzz Buzz then entails the player's overarching objective of reaching the 8 sanctuary locations, the term sanctuary being used to suggest them as a place of safety, and directs the players to the first location. The parody of Shakespeare is continued for a moment, and then the player is given the sound stone to record the 8 melodies, the item being a stone to suggest a sort of solid connection with the earth. Buzz Buzz then continues his parody, the game even attempting to further it by placing the player's cursor on yes to hear his story again. Then, Buzz Buzz dies. I'd also like to note that Buzz Buzz's death is also meant as a portion of the hero's journey, an archetype for storytelling that's existed for thousands of years, and is used in EarthBound, and I'll be noting moments correlating to it as we go. This moment correlating to the portion where the hero is separated from a guiding major figure in their life. There is also a bit of relief to the player though, as now they don't need to worry about Pokies complaining or Buzz Buzz's buzzing for the entirety of the game. The Soundstone's menu uses a distorted sample of John Lennon's Give Peace a Chance, to convey a sense that the player's mission is a pure one, and the journey is a sort of conversation between good and evil. And with that, the player exits the Minch's household.